The world is becoming more diverse. The question is, are we the people of God becoming more united? I'm Alex Diaz. Welcome to MosaixToday with Rachel and Mark. On each episode of this podcast, you'll discover unique insights, hear from credible practitioners, and learn promising practices to help you build a healthy, multi-ethnic, culturally intelligent, socially just, and financially sustainable church. The kingdom of God is not segregated. Why on earth is the church? And now, here's your host, Rachel and Mark.
Hello, and welcome to our latest episode of MosaixToday with Rachel and Mark. I'm Rachel Gilmore, here with my co-host, Mark DeMaz. And for the first time ever on our podcast, we have a special guest and an incredible author and scholar. Mark, why don't you tell us more about our special guest for today?
Today marks the beginning of season 2. In the first season, we did 7 episodes, as you and our listeners know, really just laying the groundwork of who Mosaix is, what it's about, what is some of our theology and our practicing or promising practices. So hopefully, if you haven't caught season 1, go back and catch up. That's the foundation. But now we're moving to what in season 2? Lots of interviews, interaction, again, with folks. And I can't think of a better friend and person to kick that season 2 off with in 3 special episodes talking about his new book, Beyond Racial Division, will be out with IVP February of 2022. My good friend, Dr. George Yancey. George is now a sociologist at Baylor. He spent roughly 20 years at the University of North Texas. He and I go all the way back to 2003 when we met at a very small event in Indianapolis. And together, 2004, we launched the very first little event, George, you'll recall, back there at Dwight McKissick's church in Dallas, and put it under the banner of Mosaix and just trying to bring diverse people together to begin to figure out how we can walk, work, worship God together as one beyond the distinctions of this world that otherwise divide, and ultimately build healthy multi-ethnic churches for the sake of the gospel. So George, as a co-founder of Mosaix, I welcome you as my friend. Thanks so much for giving us your time to talk about your new book and your thoughts on these important topics.
Thanks for the opportunity, Mark. Always great to see you and looking forward to diving into some of these topics.
I mentioned already 2006, Beyond Gridlock. You wrote a book for IVP. It put forth what you call the theory of mutual responsibility. You're updating that, I suppose, with a new book called Beyond Racial Division, again, out in February of 2002. You're talking about there's people that are colorblind that might identify with what you call colorblindness. Then you've got, on the other side, folks who identify with anti-racism or maybe even CRT today. And then, of course, presenting mutual accountability. So, folks, we're going to do a 3-part series right now. We're going to begin today with anti-racism. I'd like you to define that some, CRT, and then take us into that side. And then the next couple, we'll get to colorblindness and mutual accountability. But Rachel, right, anti-racism is what we're focused on today.
That's kind of the basis for our first discussion with you. So, George, do you want to take some time and unpack that for us? What are the strengths of anti-racism? What are some of your concerns which lead you to suggest an alternative?
A lot of people are talking about CRT today. And what I think has happened is CRT has become sort of the placeholder for the concerns about a lot of things that come out of anti-racism. So CRT is not exactly anti-racism, but of course they fit together pretty well. So I like to focus on anti-racism. The way I sort of define anti-racism is, and I did this by reading through a lot of anti-racism literature, and I found 3 major tenets that I think are kind of describe what it is. And the first tenet is that racism is something that's on multiple levels in multiple ways impacting our society. So it's not just, the good old boy racist, it's institutional, it's systematic. There's just a lot of ways it impacts our society. Second tenet is that we must be very intentional in addressing racism. That if we just do nothing or we just only address the overt parts of it, then it goes on. So that's the second tenet. Now, I actually agree with these first 2 tenets. I actually think that racism is more systematic than people give it credit for, and we must be proactive in addressing it. It's the third tenet where I think it gets into trouble. And that third tenet, and I saw this in book after book after book, so I'm not just taking an idea of one particular book and saying this means all anti-racist, but I saw this again and again manifest in different ways. And that third tenet is that the role of whites in addressing racism is to do what people of color want them to do. And that comes out in a lot of different ways. In white fragility, it comes out in that way. It comes out in other anti-racists who talk about how whites should be given money towards causes or convincing other whites about, but it's basically the same thing. The role of whites was to do what people of color want them to do. I think that's where it runs into a lot of problems. It runs into problems because research is showing us that when you approach people in this manner, you will get some people who will give in, capitulate to your demands. You get a lot of people who resent it. And the research shows this. For example, there's a concept out there known as white privilege. I believe white privilege is a real thing. It's a real concept. It can be defined in ways that I think are problematic, but basically it's a real concept. So when they teach about white privilege on diversity programs, what research has shown is that either whites tend to blow it off, or what happens is that people become resentful towards whites, especially marginalized whites. And so instead of becoming warmer towards marginalized people of color, that doesn't happen. What happens is that marginalized whites who are poor, homeless whites, people have less sympathy towards them. So what's happening is that in this sort of eagerness to approach a very real concept, a very real problem, the way it's being taught has not created more sympathy for people of color. It creates more hostility towards whites. There's other research that shows that diversity programs, anti-racism creates a backlash, or it creates this notion that we have solved this problem. It's just not helpful for doing what it claims to want to do, which is to address racial issues. And I'll end this first question with this research, which I think is very fascinating. One of the problems anti-racists correctly point out is that we don't have enough people of color who are managers, who are managers of companies. And so we have whites who are managers. So how do we address this? One of the ways we can address this is by mandatory diversity programs, or by requiring whites to use tests to make sure you screen out people without race, or things of this nature, or grievance programs. Well, the research shows that when you do that, 5 years later, you actually have fewer managers of color. But if you incorporate elements that bring whites into the conversation, 5 years later, you have more managers of color. Anti-racism actually, in some situations, makes things worse instead of making things better.
So full disclosure here, as a millennial pastor and a woman out in the West, I feel really drawn to the anti-racist movement, post George Floyd, as I think even like Gen Z, the generation below me, almost 90% of our younger generation are really drawn to this movement. And I completely agree with the first 2 points that you outlined. And the third one, which you discussed about how white people, I'm a white woman, right? That we are supposed to not be leading this movement, but listening to people of color who are leading the anti-racist movement. I see that as well, but I'm wondering what the alternative is. I hear you saying that white and Black people, all people should be working together to solve the problem of anti-racism. But in my experience, it can be really hard because white people don't always come with the same knowledge of how deeply systemic it is. And so I wonder how helpful those conversations can be if they're not coming with equal knowledge to the table. Does that make sense? Because then you can get into the whole white savior complex. Well, sure, I'll just come in and solve racism for my community as a white woman. And then I become a Karen and, everything kind of devolves. So what are your thoughts about that? Like what should, if someone who's white realizes that racism is systemic, that we have to actually take action or do something to bring equity, then what next?
Sure. Yeah. I think that's a great question. And let me just say, on both anti-racism and colorblindness, there are times in which I enact the principles of both. What anti-racism has done very well is point out how systematic racism is and how problematic it is and the historical effects. And sometimes, colorblindness are correct. When I grade my papers, for example, I do not take race into consideration as a professor. I'm colorblind. So there are times where they're correct. So let me just be clear about that. But the problem is that they give half of the solution. Part of the solution is that whites have to listen to people of color. That is undoubtedly part of the solution. And if whites do not listen to people of color, we cannot solve this problem. But just as, whites oftentimes miss things, we people of color miss things too. And sometimes our solutions, whether we want to admit it or not, can be self-serving. They could be good for what we want, but not necessarily good for everyone out there. And so we have to listen to each other if we're going to find solutions. So that's one aspect. But here's something else. Let's say, just for the sake of argument, that I, as an African-American man, have got it all. I figured it out. I know exactly what needs to be done in order to solve racism in our society. I'm an African-American man. I'm a professor of sociology. I study this stuff. I have it all figured out. How's the best way for me to communicate to people? If I go the anti-racism route, basically what it's saying is, you white people, be quiet. Listen to us, listen to me, and I'll tell you what to do. Now, we know from research how effective that is in communicating to people. It's not. Or what if my communication to you was more of, look, I want to hear where you're coming from. Let's say where I'm coming from. Let's bring our knowledge into it. And let's see if we can find solutions together. Research shows that is a more effective way. So even if I have it all figured out, and just so everyone knows, so you don't take it out of context, I don't. But even if I do, the way we're doing it with anti-racism is not very effective. And I think that's why that research on managers of color is very telling. I do believe we need more managers of color out there. I think we are missing something when your managers are all white. Even if they're good-hearted, great white people, not a racist bone in their body, you're missing something while your managers are white. But if I want to diversify the manager pool, I need to listen to those white managers because they may know something on how to diversify it more than I do, even though I'm a person of color. They're managers. They know how things work. We should listen to each other, and we'll find better solutions that way. That's why I think anti-racism has some answers, but they're incomplete answers.
George, let me jump in right there. And people today talk about speaking truth to power. It seems to me that people value the speaking, not so much the outcome of the speaking. And I learned way back that it's the idea, what I want to do is try to bend the ear of power or of those people with whom I disagree, not to get them to come all my way, but shouldn't the goal be to find some type of mutuality, to work on common responses? And that requires, I think is what I hear you saying, how do we go about winning people, or at least moving the needle with those on the opposite side, avoiding cancel culture and all the painful polarization we have today? I think I told you this, Rachel, I had put together a group for diversity training way back for pastors in the city. And the two African-American men that led it, we all sat down, and the first thing they said is, the first thing you need to realize is all of you are racist because you're white, and you're all sexist because you're men. I can tell you that shut the entire room down for the next 2 days, and very little progress was made. So yes, there's that privilege, et cetera, but how do we communicate it? I think that's what I hear you saying.
Yeah. And let me put it in a different direction, since this is, we're Christians. When we do evangelism work, we don't come to people and say, you're a sinner, why don't you just, believe in the, what do we do? We actually make connections with people. Let's try to figure out where their needs are. We actually do rapport with people. And we know this as Christians, because any Christians try to do evangelism knows that if you come with a heavy-handed, thou art a sinner, or someone you've barely met, that gets, with some rare exceptions, that gets turned away. We know that the way for us to reach people is to develop a rapport, to learn where they're coming from. And as Christians, we think, as Christians, we think Jesus Christ is the only way. And so this is not even a question of, we believe we're supposed to be right on this. Even so, we know that that's not the way you reach people. So I just think that we, especially as Christians engaging in anti-racism, really need to think about, why don't we do this when it comes to evangelism? Why don't we have this sort of approach? Because we know that doesn't work. So if it doesn't work with evangelism, why do we think it works on another topic that's very sensitive, which is race?
And I guess this kind of ties into where, as a white woman involved in the Black Lives Matter movement, I think it's important for me with that same kind of tenet. Incarnationally, it's easier for me to go to white women and say, listen, I had racist, ideations, didn't even know it. I was making decisions that were harmful to people of color. So, let me share about my journey out of a place of humility and just learning in hopes that maybe parts of it would resonate with you. So I guess in my mind, that's where I still feel like, while everybody needs to have a voice when it comes to like anti-racism. So many of us are quick to like jump in and say, from the dominant culture, because we're used to having that platform, oh, this is how it should be done. So I like the aspect of listening first and yet working towards this collaborative, cooperative effort of moving forward. All of us using our own affinity groups and our experience to help other people learn, not from a place of aggression. And I think that's another common misconception, is that a lot of the anti-racist protests are violent or about destroying things. And, I was in Charlottesville, and that was like years ago, because our bishop from the church asked us to show up with signs of love, saying, we love you. We're here to pray with you and to walk alongside and bring safety and peace to this community. And it was a really powerful experience to just witness how the hatred is still so present in our society. That's one of many reasons why I'm like grateful that you wrote this book, just to bring this conversation into a Christian theological lens. Although I'm grateful that you mentioned it's for anybody. You don't have to be a Christian to draw value from this text, but looking at what anti-racism is and what it might have to offer. But that you're right, you can't just say, well, now people who are white people have to do anything and everything that people of color say. That hasn't been my experience in the community, but that would be harmful, right?
And moving along from what Rachel said, then I want you to get some thoughts on CRT. I know that anti-racism is one thing. You made that clear in the beginning. You see one as more of a practice, right? Anti-racism is a practice, and CRT is more of a theory or a philosophy. Maybe for those listening, if you could give some distinction to those two, your thoughts on those things, I think that'd be helpful.
Yeah, let me go ahead and do the CRT question and break it down, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions of that. Our CRT proper is a legal theory. It's a legal theory, and people, rightly say it came out of the Frankfurter School of Critical Theory, although it's not purely Marxian in nature. And it's a legal theory that hooks in on how racism is incorporated into the laws of our country and this sort of thing. There is what I would call derivatives of CRT. I'll say anti-racism is a derivative of CRT, which are implications of that, but are not CRT proper. And so when someone says, let's get CRT out of our schools, usually they're not talking about CRT, but the derivatives of CRT. Some of the things, some approaches from that. And then there's the larger, which is just the argument on race in our society, where CRT becomes whatever people want it to become. And so that's why it's problematic when states try to pass laws saying we're going to ban CRT. Well, what do you mean by that? Because I tell you, your kids are not being taught CRT proper in your elementary schools. It's just too complicated for that. CRT proper is taught in graduate schools. Maybe it's touched on in some undergraduate classes, and that's it, CRT proper. Anti-racism, which is, what people are talking about, how they do things, how they approach things, white fragility, Ibram Kimbram stuff, that's a derivative. If you go to D'Angelo or Kendi and ask them, are you a CRT theorist? They would say no, and they'd be correct. That doesn't mean that CRT has not influenced what they're doing, but they're not a theorist in CRT, which is much more of a legal type of theory.
I'm thinking about this with related to those two distinctions, anti-racism, CRT. You're very definitely saying there are things to be learned. There are structural issues. Yeah. We need to take anti-racism and or CRT serious. There's strength in it and perhaps weakness that you can point out in our next podcast. But on the strength side, what, again, can we learn? I want to make sure you have a chance to say that.
I think the strengths and paradoxically the weaknesses of both is the same thing, which is it forces us to really look on how racism has impacted us in our society and not to be passive about it, not to just say, well, I have Black friends, therefore I'm not a racist, that sort of garbage. So it forces us to look at how CRT, how our legal system has been shaped by racism. Other anti-racism elements, they're not necessarily CRT, but may look at, say, how our government, how our churches, are anti-racist. That's also the weaknesses of it, because you begin to find racism everywhere once you start doing that, if you're not careful. And that's why we need conversation. We need it brought into the conversation, but we also need others to say, look, maybe you're overreaching in this way. And it does overreach. There are overreaches there. And so that's, where I think both of the strength and the weakness of them lie.
That's super helpful. I wish we had hours just to talk about this. I don't know. It's an ongoing discussion, right? And so it's important that we're starting it here. I do want to end, though. You talked about the importance of conversation and listening to each other. I know from looking at social media, from my own circles, from the United Methodist denomination, that when it comes to clergy, pastors of color, a lot of them are exhausted because they've had to have so many conversations, and it's led to this place of like tokenism. Will you speak for the entire Black race in terms of the response to George Floyd? And they're just tired or fatigued. So what would your, words of encouragement or suggestion be for clergy of color who are overwhelmed or fatigued right now with having to be the spokesperson?
First, take breaks. I take breaks sometimes from social media because it gets tiring on me. Second, we have to speak, because if we don't speak, then we can't. I cannot read your mind as a woman minister. And so if there's issues for you as a woman minister and you expect me to read your mind, you're at fault, because I'm not going to read your mind. If you speak to me, then you can hold me accountable for what you say. Not that I have to exactly do everything you say, but at least I've heard what you've had to say. We cannot expect people to hear us if we don't speak. So take breaks as needed. I mean, look, I've learned I've got to take breaks, but I can't shut up. I can't say, well, I'm tired of this. I tried. God told me no. Mark knows. I tried to get away from this. God has said no. So we have to keep speaking out as we're able to. Because we can't let other people speak for us and then expect people to understand where we're coming from.
Well, as you just said, George, or Rachel, I should say, man, we needed a whole hour on this, but we're so glad you covered in a brief time just one aspect of that upcoming book from Dr. George Yancey, Beyond Racial Division, coming out February of 2022. This segment, again, just some basic thoughts about anti-racism, some of the pros and cons, weaknesses, the things you shared, the idea of how it's true. This impacts our society. There's historicity here. There's deeply embedded systems and all of that. And on the other hand, finding some ways to say that, like you point out in the book about Einstein, right? You can't keep repeating the same thing over and over again, expect the same results. So there's got to be something different. I know next time, Rachel, we're going to get into the other side of that continuum, color blindness, as George talks about, right?
Absolutely. So thank you so much, George, for your thoughts on that and suggestions. I'm so grateful that we had this discussion today on anti-racism. And I want to thank all of our listeners for joining in on this first podcast. And we hope that you can join us next time. We will be talking about color blindness and engaging in dialogue with George about that as well. So we appreciate you being part of our community here at Mosaix Today with Rachel and Mark.
You've been listening to Mosaix Today with Rachel and Mark. Take a moment to like, leave a comment, and subscribe to this podcast. To learn more about who we are, what we do, and why, visit MosaixToday.info. That's MosaixToday.info. I'm Alex Diaz. We'll see you next time on Mosaix Today.